This is our country. It's your future, and we're building it together. We're catalyzing a series of nation-building projects in energy, in trade, critical minerals, transport, data, and beyond. These projects will make Canada stronger, more resilient, and more independent. They'll create good jobs and grow our economy, providing the resources that we need to take care of ourselves and take care of each other. And to make sure that all Canadians can share in these benefits.
Every loaf of bread carries a history, every bowl of pasta, every plate built from grain that was seeded into the earth, cultivated across a season, harvested, and processed before it ever reached your table. Canada is a significant contributor to that history, the third largest wheat exporting nation on Earth. 34 million metric tons of some of the highest quality grain is produced anywhere on the planet. Donald Trump demanded access to it this morning on American terms. Mark Carney refused, and that refusal landed not only in Washington, but across every grain trading desk, every food ministry, and every agricultural market on Earth that understands what it means when the world's third largest wheat exporter tells the world's largest economy that its demand was not a trade proposal. It was an overreach. And Canada does not accommodate overreach. Please take a seat, because what happened in the wheat sector today is not just another rotation in a familiar dispute. It is the moment this trade confrontation entered the one territory that connects economic policy to the most irreducible human necessity on Earth. Food, not oil, which can be displaced over time by renewable alternatives, not aluminum, which can be sourced from different producers across different continents, not uranium, which nuclear utilities can hold in reserve for years. Wheat, the grain that sustains billions of people, the commodity that sits at the base of food security for nations on every continent, across every income level. Donald Trump reached for Canada's wheat this morning, applying the same logic he has to every previous resource demand in this confrontation. That Canadian supply creates Canadian vulnerability. That's what Canada sells, America needs. That need generates leverage. That leverage produces compliance. The logic has collapsed 6 times before this morning. It collapsed again today. And the reason it keeps collapsing is the same reason it failed today. Carney understands the actual shape of the leverage more completely than the administration attempting to deploy it. At 8:41 this morning, the United States Department of Agriculture and the Office of the United States Trade Representative released a joint demand document addressed to the Government of Canada. The document described what it called an urgent requirement for guaranteed and preferential American access to Canadian wheat exports, Canadian grain processing capacity, and Canadian agricultural logistics infrastructure. The demand contained 4 specific requirements. The first required Canada to guarantee American grain purchasers the right of first refusal on Canadian wheat exports before any allocation was directed to other international customers. In operational terms, this meant American buyers would receive priority access ahead of all other nations currently purchasing Canadian wheat, including Middle Eastern, Asian, and African nations that depend on Canadian grain for a substantial share of their population's food supply. The second requirement demanded that Canada restructure its grain grading and quality standards around American preferences rather than the international frameworks Canada currently applies. The third required preferential pricing for American wheat buyers through a joint pricing mechanism that would give American representatives direct influence over Canadian export price decisions. The fourth demanded that Canadian agricultural infrastructure, grain terminals, storage facilities, processing capacity, be made accessible to American commercial interests through investment frameworks that had not been negotiated or agreed upon. Read those 4 requirements in sequence, and the underlying architecture is consistent with every resource demand this administration has previously advanced. Identify something Canada possesses. Establish American priority access to it. Acquire influence over the pricing. Gain a foothold in the physical infrastructure. convert a Canadian sovereign resource into a strategic American asset, administered through frameworks that permanently embed Washington's institutional influence in Canadian resource decisions. The administration had applied this template to oil, to uranium, to potash, to natural gas, to electricity. This morning, it applied the same template to wheat, and it delivered the demand to a prime minister who had answered every previous version of this template with precisely the same response he gave today. Before reaching Carney's refusal, it is worth explaining something specific about wheat that distinguishes this demand in character from the resource demands that preceded it. Even within the shared pattern, they all reflect. Oil is strategically significant. Uranium carries military weight. Potash supports agricultural production. Natural gas heats homes and powers industrial facilities. All of those things carry enormous consequences. But wheat feeds people directly. It moves from field to mill to bakery to table through a chain so immediate and so short that disrupting it produces consequences that are visible, personal, and politically impossible to absorb within weeks rather than months or years. Canada exports wheat to approximately 70 nations. A substantial number of those nations are located in regions where food security is structurally fragile, where domestic grain production falls short of population requirements, and where Canadian wheat represents not a commercial preference but a nutritional foundation. When the United States demands American priority access to Canadian wheat before any allocation is made to other international buyers, it is not advancing a trade position. It is proposing that American commercial interests take precedence over food security in nations that depend on Canadian grain to feed their populations. That is not a trade argument in any recognizable sense. It is a food security argument. And Carney framed it in precisely those terms when he declined. At 1:29 this afternoon, Mark Carney appeared before reporters in Ottawa. He was accompanied by Canada's Minister of Agriculture and Agri-Food and the Canadian ambassador to the United Nations World Food Programme. The presence of the World Food Programme ambassador communicated something to every journalist in the room before Carney opened his mouth. What Canada was about to say would not be framed as a bilateral trade response. It would be framed as something considerably larger, something that extended beyond the Canada-US relationship into the global food system that Canadian wheat actively sustains. Carney opened without a diplomatic preamble. He confirmed that Canada had received and reviewed the joint demand from the Department of Agriculture and the trade representative. He said Canada's answer was no. Then he explained why, with the analytical precision that has marked every consequential statement he has delivered throughout this confrontation. He said the first demand, American priority access to Canadian wheat before any allocation to other international buyers, would require Canada to deprioritize food supply commitments to nations that depend on Canadian wheat for the nutritional security of their populations. He identified the categories of nations affected: those across North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, South and Southeast Asia, and the Middle East, where food import dependency is high, domestic production is constrained, and Canadian wheat is not a commercial luxury, but a foundation of food security. Canada will not subordinate its food needs to American commercial interests, not for any trade arrangement, not under any pressure, not through any framework Washington designs. He said the second demand, American-aligned grading standards, would require Canada to dismantle an agricultural quality framework developed across more than a century of grain production expertise, built to serve Canadian producers, international buyers, and global market requirements simultaneously. Canadian wheat grading standards are not a barrier to American access. They are a quality assurance architecture that makes Canadian wheat one of the most sought-after grain varieties in international markets. Restructuring them around American commercial preferences would erode the international reputation that makes Canadian wheat valuable to every buyer, including American ones. He said the third demand, preferential pricing through an American-influenced joint mechanism, was identical to the pricing control provision the administration had attempted to embed in frameworks for oil, natural gas, and potash. The answer was the same as every previous answer Canada had given. Canadian resources are priced through market mechanisms that reflect Canadian production costs, international market conditions, and Canadian commercial interests. American representation in a joint pricing body is not a commercial arrangement. It is a foreign pricing authority over a Canadian resource. Canada does not accept foreign pricing authority over its resources, regardless of how that authority is labeled or structured. He said the fourth demand, American investment access to Canadian agricultural infrastructure, would place American commercial entities inside the physical architecture of Canadian food production and export, Canadian grain terminals, Canadian processing facilities, Canadian storage systems. These are not investment opportunities available for acquisition through trade pressure. They are sovereign infrastructure serving Canadian agricultural interests and the international food security commitments Canada has made to its trading partners worldwide. Then Carney announced 3 immediate actions that collectively constituted Canada's response, and something considerably more significant than a response. The first was the formal submission of Canada's wheat export commitment framework to the United Nations World Food Programme and the Food and Agriculture Organization. The submission documented Canada's existing wheat export commitments to food-insecure nations and formally registered them as Canadian sovereign obligations that take precedence over any bilateral trade demands from any single importing nation, regardless of its economic scale. Canada was entering its food security commitments into the institutional international record, not as diplomatic gestures, but as documented sovereign obligations with formal standing in international food governance bodies. The second was the announcement that Canada had finalized long-term wheat supply agreements with 7 nations across the Middle East, North Africa, and Sub-Saharan Africa, providing supply certainty at stable prices for 5 years. The agreements had been under active negotiation for several months. They were being finalized and announced today specifically because the American demand for priority access had created the political and diplomatic context for locking in alternative market commitments that would permanently reduce the share of Canadian wheat exposed to American market pressure. The demand intended to extend American reach into Canadian wheat had instead accelerated the permanent redirection of Canadian supply toward buyers who had not made sovereignty demands as a condition of commerce. The third was the activation of Canada's agricultural sovereignty framework, covering wheat and all Canadian grain exports. Under this framework, the Canada Grain Commission was directed to treat all export allocation decisions as national interest determinations, requiring an assessment of Canadian food security obligations, international humanitarian commitments, and sovereign commercial interests before any allocation was made to any buyer. The framework made explicit what Carney had been stating throughout the confrontation. Canadian resources serve Canadian interests and Canadian international obligations first. The bilateral relationship with the United States is one factor among many within that assessment. It is not the overriding factor. No demand from Washington will reposition it. Global grain markets moved immediately after Carney's statement reached trading desks. Canadian wheat futures rose as long-term supply agreements with Middle Eastern and African buyers established a floor under Canadian export volumes, reducing market uncertainty about supply availability. International wheat prices adjusted modestly as traders processed the implications of a meaningful portion of Canadian export capacity being committed to long-term agreements that reduce spot market availability for buyers without established supply relationships. Inside the United States, the reaction was divided along the lines that have characterized every previous round of this confrontation. Agricultural state senators handling constituent concerns, received a new wave of calls from American grain buyers, troubled by the long-term agreements Canada had announced with non-American customers. The concern was commercial and immediate. If Canadian wheat export capacity is increasingly absorbed by long-term agreements with Middle Eastern and African buyers, American buyers competing for Canadian wheat in future seasons will be working with a smaller pool of uncommitted supply in a tighter market. The demand constructed to guarantee American access to Canadian wheat had produced a Canadian response that reduced future American access more concretely than any prior measure. It had accelerated precisely the outcome it was designed to prevent. The World Food Programme issued a statement welcoming Canada's submission of its export commitment framework and its formalization of supply agreements with food-insecure nations. Several governments whose food security depends on Canadian wheat release statements, thanking Ottawa for maintaining the supply relationships on which their populations depend. The international dimension of Carney's response was functioning as designed. By framing the refusal in terms of food security obligations to vulnerable nations, Canada had made the American demand internationally visible as one that prioritized American commercial interests over humanitarian food supply needs in nations without the resources to secure alternative suppliers quickly. That framing was not rhetorical, it was analytically accurate, and its accuracy made it impossible to contest without the administration explicitly arguing that American commercial preferences should supersede food access in nations that cannot easily replace the Canadian supply. 3 scenarios from here. In the first scenario, the combination of the international food security framing of Canada's refusal and the domestic American anxiety about reduced future wheat access generates sufficient pressure that the administration withdraws the wheat demand within 30 days. The long-term agreements Canada has executed with Middle Eastern and African buyers remain permanent commercial relationships serving Canadian agricultural interests, independent of whatever bilateral resolution eventually emerges. Canada's agricultural sovereignty framework remains as a standing policy governing all future grain export decisions. A broader bilateral negotiating process begins, one that excludes wheat access demands because the international and domestic political costs of maintaining them have become concrete and publicly visible. In the second scenario, the administration escalates by imposing new trade measures targeting Canadian agricultural exports to the American market. Canada activates its full agricultural countermeasures suite, imposing retaliatory tariffs on American farm goods in the states generating the most consistent political pressure on the administration. The combination of Canadian counter-tariffs on American agricultural exports and reduced Canadian wheat availability for American buyers, as long-term agreements increasingly commit Canadian supply to non-American customers, creates agricultural sector consequences on the American side that exceed anything the previous rounds of this confrontation produced. The political pressure from American farming communities reaches a level that forces genuine administrative flexibility within 60 days. In the third scenario, Canada's formalization of long-term wheat supply agreements with food-insecure nations and its submission of export commitments to international food institutions produces a durable realignment of Canadian agricultural trade relationships. The Middle Eastern, North African, and Sub-Saharan African nations receiving long-term supply certainty from Canada develop deeper commercial and diplomatic relationships with Ottawa that extend beyond the wheat file into agricultural technology, water management, and broader food system development. Canada emerges from the trade confrontation as a more consequential actor in global food security governance than it was when the confrontation began. The demand designed to subordinate Canadian wheat to American commercial priorities has instead embedded Canadian agricultural capacity more deeply in the global food architecture that depends on it. Every loaf of bread carries a history. This morning, Donald Trump attempted to rewrite Canada's contribution to that history. He tried to make American commercial access the opening paragraph, the overriding claim on Canadian grain, positioned ahead of every other nation's food security consideration. Carney declined to let him, not with indignation, not with theatrical confrontation, but with a precise, documented, internationally submitted refusal that placed Canada's food security obligations to vulnerable nations in the permanent record of international institutions before Washington could frame its demand as anything other than what it was. Canadian wheat feeds the world. Canada determines who receives it, when they receive it, at what price, and through what commercial arrangements. That is what sovereignty means in practice. That is what Carney has been defending since the opening day of this confrontation. Across every resource file, every payment system, every shipping corridor, and every legal submission this trade war has generated. Today, he defended it in the domain where the stakes are most immediate and most human. The domain of food. The refusal he delivered will be studied not only in Washington, but in every capital where governments are watching Canada and learning what it looks like when a nation determines that its sovereign resources serve its sovereign interests and its international obligations, not the demands of whoever applies the most pressure, not the preferences of whoever holds the larger economy. Canada's interests, Canada's obligations, Canada's decision, always. We will be tracking every development as this story continues. If you are not subscribed, please do so now and turn on the notification bell. Could you share this with someone who needs to understand what is actually happening here? We are on this story continuously. Thank you for watching. We will see you in the next one.